This is Smarter San Diego TV.
The real estate inspection company is in the house and here to educate us about polybutylene plumbing. Please welcome Philippe Heller.
Here he is, Philippe. What's up, my man?
Always good to see you.
Good to see you too, brother. Thanks for bringing such great information to us today. This polybutylene piping thing is something I saw. I believe there was some sort of class action lawsuit, wasn't there? Was that recent?
Yeah, I'll give you a quick history. Back in the late 70s, they came up with a new type of plumbing. They thought, let's get rid of copper, which is expensive and takes a lot of soldering, a lot of expense, and copper's expensive, and you can get a leak anyway. This is when they were putting it in the slabs and you were getting slab leaks. So they came up with a new type of plastic plumbing that was supposed to solve all these issues. Didn't corrode, didn't leak. It was easy to install, it was cheaper for the builders to put in, and so it was used tremendously throughout America, but especially in San Diego, because a lot of the building took place during the 80s and 90s, and so we still see it a lot.
Okay, so this was supposed to be the new best thing, but it turns out that that's not the case.
Yes, what happened, it was developed by Chevron, and what happened is there was a chemical reaction with our water in Southern California. So some of the oxidants, some of the like chlorine, some of the chemicals they put in the water to clean the water affected the plastic connectors. So it's almost like a big drip system, and they fit it together, and the connectors were adversely affected by the chemicals in the water. And what would happen over time is they would develop little cracks, or the system would break altogether and flood the house.
Okay, that's not good. So this happens a lot of times in the connections because they have to use some sort of adhesive there, right?
No, they didn't. They didn't use adhesive. So it's not like a PVC system that you might have, but it's more like a drip system, if you've ever put that in, where it just fits together with compression fittings. So I brought a sample today. This is from a little bit newer. This one doesn't have the plastic fittings. This one actually has a copper fitting, but you can see how they put the pipe on the fitting and then they crimp it with these crimps here. These are copper crimps. Original versions had aluminum crimps, which also didn't fare well with the heating, the expansion and contraction from hot water. So sometimes it was the crimp that failed, and because this is under pressure, it would just burst apart. And it was like turning a garden hose on in your attic, and of course would flood the house rather quickly. So the tubing was fine. It was always the fittings and the connections that failed. And a lot of people assume that this was recalled, and it was not. There was never actually a government recall of polybutylene plumbing, but it was a class action lawsuit. And there's a lot of misinformation out there about the plumbing and what happened to it and what recourse you have if, in fact, you do have it in your house. Okay,
so let's say I do have it in my house. What should I do? I mean, is am I lucky that something bad hasn't happened yet?
Yes, you're lucky. Now, all plumbing systems can fail. Copper, PEX, old galvanized steel, it can all fail. But this is more prone to failure. So the first thing you should do if you have it is check your pressure in your house, keep it down to like 45 or 50 PSI, because that obviously puts less pressure on the connections. Keep your temperature down too, to about 125, because the hotter the temperature, the more it expands and contracts and it puts more stress on it. And then you really should budget to repipe your house to avoid the flood.
How much does it cost to repipe a house in general? I know it depends on the size.
Yeah, it does depend on the size and construction, because a two-story house makes it much more difficult to run plumbing to the downstairs bathrooms, for example. A one-story house is pretty easy. You go through the attic, go right down the wall, pretty straightforward. It's still going to cost you $8,000 or more on a simple house, and it can go way up from there because you have to cut sheetrock, sometimes open up cabinets, do a lot of cosmetic work in addition to the plumbing. So it's a very expensive thing.
Now, if I'm buying a house, because this is where you typically are doing the most of your work for people who are buying houses.
Correct.
And you're checking it out to make sure that they know exactly what it is they're buying.
Yes.
Now, how do you determine in that process if they've got these polybutylene piping systems or not?
Yes.
Because a lot of times you can't see that stuff with the naked eye.
Well, one of the responsibilities of a home inspector is to identify the plumbing system for the buyer so that you know what you're getting. If it's an older home from the 30s, does it still have galvanized steel plumbing? Terrible, probably rusted through or completely, just terrible, needs to be replaced. Is it copper? Is it a newer PEX? And polybutylene should not be confused with PEX. So if you're in a brand new house and you go up in your attic and you see all this plastic tubing, that's polyethylene, or it's called PEX, that's okay, that's acceptable. There haven't been any problems with it yet, except that we have seen where rodents will chew through it. So that's another whole issue with any kind of plastic plumbing, is that rodents can chew through it. But if you go up in the attic in a newer home, you may see that it's fine. If you have a house that was built from, let's say, early 80s to early 90s, those are the suspect years. As a home inspector, we identify the type of plumbing. Even though this wasn't recalled, it's something that could affect the perceived value of a house. People know that houses with polybutylene are subject to flooding, and therefore it affects their perceived value. And that's why it's so important that a home inspector identifies this. And there are some ways to do it. Of course, you can go in the attic, and sometimes you can visibly see these gray tubes through the attic. Sometimes it's not so easy, especially in a two-story house. Even if you look under a sink, they transition this to a copper stub that sticks out of the wall. So if you look under the sink or behind a toilet, you may simply see a copper pipe sticking out of the wall. That's not conclusive. We've developed a few tests that we use that can confirm the presence or absence of plastic plumbing without having to open the walls, and that's even if you can't see it in the attic.
Really?
Yes.
So if you can't see the plumbing in the attic, you do not need to get into the walls to be able to tell someone if they have this type of piping in their house.
Correct.
Wow. That's got to be your proprietary
It is. It's
system,
a
then.
test that we've developed in-house that our inspectors use so that we can confidently tell somebody when they have something other than copper plumbing. And there's a few other telltale signs about how the electrical is hooked up, how it's grounded, but just simply doing a visual and seeing what's exposed isn't always conclusive. So if you have questions about it, you can give us a call. We'll try and walk you through it. Worst case, if you need us to come out there. If you're going to be selling a home, this is something that can derail a sale almost immediately, because either you're going to be asked for a concession to repipe the house, or the buyer's going to walk away because they don't want to deal with this stuff.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy. Well, I mean, it's great that you can be able to tell that stuff, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but these types of flood incidents can happen whether you're home or not. In other words, whether you've turned on the faucet or not, because there's pressure always on these pipes, isn't there?
As a matter of fact, when you're away, which is kind of Murphy's Law of when a lot of floods do occur, it's because your water heater, if you have a traditional tank water heater, it's still keeping that water hot, and pressure actually builds over time because it is never released. You're never turning on a faucet to relieve that pressure. So when you're gone, it's not the act of turning on or off a faucet that causes it. It can be the pressure that builds up in the system while you're away. That's why I said you want to keep your pressure regulated very low, especially if you have polybutylene.
So if you do have it, it may not be the end of the world, but it's something that you need to be aware of. You need to know what you're risking, and you probably need to get some kind of an estimate on what it would cost to go ahead and fix those pipes, because if you have a flood situation, that is going to have additional costs on top of the fact that you're now going to have to replace.
Yeah, and most homeowners insurance companies will cover that damage. They may not come in and repipe your whole house, so it's still something that you're going to have to deal with at some point. That's a little bit out of our scope of expertise. Coming at it from a buyer or a seller, it's something you need to know, because it is something that does play a role in the purchase of a house.
And it's specifically here in San Diego where we're seeing the issue because of the type of water that we have.
Southern California, yes, and it's all over San Diego, from Carmel Mountain Ranch to Ramona to some of the older parts of Rancho Bernardo. Like I said, if you have a house built from the early 80s to the early 90s and it's a tract house, usually custom houses don't have it, but if it was, built in a large development, there's a high probability that your house was built with polybutylene.
And this is something that you absolutely need to know. Great
Absolutely.
stuff. Philippe Heller, appreciate your time, man.
Always
You're
a
amazing.
pleasure.
Stick around for more Smarter San Diego TV, where we guarantee to make you smarter than everyone else, commercial free.